Welcome everybody, Shabbat Shalom. So this week we begin the reading of the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. So we get to hear everything all over again, except sometimes we don't. And we'll talk about all that. As just a brief introduction to the book of Devarim, this book, as the title suggests, consists mostly of words, speeches of Moses, and mainly reviews events in the mitzvot that occurred earlier in the Torah. So I don't know if I've gotten screen sharing privileges yet. I did, okay. Just a couple of, just for a moment, just to give you an overview of the book. Well, that's the third one. Let me give you the first one first. So the book consists of all sorts of speeches. I won't continue to do that, but each one of them has a theme, and it goes on throughout the book. And of course, later in the summer, we'll hear more and more about these speeches. But one of the things about this book that's interesting is the rest of the Torah is sort of related from the point of view of an anonymous narrator. Describes God, describes the events of the character of the story in the third person. But the narrator in this book is Moses, and he's speaking in himself. You don't hear the phrase, and God spoke to Moses saying in this book. It's all Moses saying. And but sometimes when he reiterates history, the story changes, and we'll talk a little bit about that. In addition, Moses talks a little bit about his own personal feelings in a way that we haven't really heard before. So we'll see. We hear a lot about the mitzvot in Devarim. We don't hear a lot about the mitzvot of ritual purity or sacrifice that we've heard more about in the other books. And as you probably know and remember, that this book concludes with the death of Moses, spoiler alert, and the children of Israel are about to enter the promised land. So that's sort of an overview of the book. We're going to hear a lot more about it in the weeks to come with some wonderful, wonderful Torah. However, this week's parsha is Devarim, the name of the book, and the parsha itself. And it's a recap of some of the early material that we've heard, particularly about the journey through the desert. I should just say as an aside, I'm a big fan of the TV show Jeopardy. And for all of you who might think about getting on Jeopardy, one of the hints about success on that show is knowing geography. If you should go on Jeopardy and they want to ask you about geography in the Bible,
yes.
Whoops, sorry. Let me try that again. Sure. We've seen this map before, but it didn't go on. So I'm sorry. So I'm Zoom. There it is. So we've seen this map before, and all of these names are mentioned in the beginning of the book as Moses starts his reiteration of the travel through the wilderness. I'm not going to go through that except to mention that reading these sections of Torah and the last couple of parshiot that we read in the last couple of weeks is very difficult, because it's all about they went here, and then they went here, and then they went here. And some of those names are very esoteric. And so I always offer congratulations to the people who are reading Torah during these periods of time. So the book starts off. I'm just going to give a sort of a brief overview of the parsha. Then I have a bunch of things that perhaps we can talk about. Moses starts off in verse 6 talking about moving on to the land. And he talks about the fact that he's overwhelmed with the responsibility and appoints leaders from every tribe. And this is one of the many differences that we see between here and in earlier stories. And then he goes on to say, he talks about when he appoints these leaders, he gives them a charge, and he says, you should not be partial in judgment. Hear out low and high alike. Fear no man, for judgment is God's. And any matter that is too difficult for you, bring to me and I'll hear it. So right, we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And then in verse 22, this is perhaps the most dramatic difference from the earlier accounts. We hear a very different version of the plan to send the spies out. As you recall in Bamidbar, it was God who commanded Moses to send the spies. in this account that Moses is telling us, he says that it was the people who came to him with suggestions. And then when he talks about the spies, he somehow forgets to report that the spies came back and talked about the giants and the other obstacles that we heard about in Bamidbar. And he basically just fails the people, blames the people for failing to heed God's command. Rather than what we heard in Bamidbar, where the people were just sort of in terror after they heard the report of the spies. And then Moses later on castigates the people who are complaining again that God will fight for you. And the people say in verse 27, it was because the Lord hated us that he brought us out of the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites and wipe us out. So they're, a very cantankerous lot. And as a result, Moses then reiterates that all of these people who refuse to listen to God's will won't enter the promised land. And this applies to Moses as well. And then finally, in sort of my summary, we have a series of pronouncements that the part of the land is actually promised to other peoples that are not so-called the promised people that we thought we had unique view of. And that includes the land of Seir, promised to the descendants of Esau, Moab, and for the descendants of Lot, or Ar, rather, for the descendants of Lot. And we hear that the Lord wiped out the prior inhabitants of those lands to benefit the current inhabitants, which I thought was interesting. And two more things. One is I was intrigued when they talk about going through the land of Heshbon. They say, well, let's, make nice to us, we'll make nice to you. But it says in the text, the Lord stiffened the will of the king of Heshbon and hardened his heart in order to deliver him into your power. In other words, he wasn't going to make it. It was God's will that they should fight, and then God's will that they should win. And I thought that sounded pretty familiar, this hardening of the heart. And perhaps we can talk about that a little bit. And finally, the Parsha ends, do not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who will battle for you. So that's the Parsha. We have a lot of really interesting stuff coming up in future Parshiot, but I think there were a couple of things here that was interesting. And one of them is where I just ended, and that is God's place in history. This Parsha and really much of what we've heard in the last few weeks talks about God as a warrior. Warrior, sort of, you have this vision of the medieval kings leading their troops in battle, carrying the standard, and this is the metaphor that we're seeing with you. And I wonder if this resonates with you. I would just say, when we open the Ark in the Torah service, we say, "Vayihi ben Soharon, Kuma Adonai, scatter your foes so that your enemies will flee your presence." I mean, we continue to use that metaphor in our liturgy every time we take out the Torah. And I wonder if that metaphor, as God as warrior, works for you these days.
Well, I always thought it was interesting that Adonai Tzvaot, a phrase we use often in the prayer, which literally means God of armies, is translated as Lord of hosts, as though that somehow sort of softened the meaning, but that Tzava is an army, and it's the warrior God that we're saluting at that point. We've sort of soft pedaled away from it.
So I learned last week that you were in the Israel armed forces. Was there a discussion of that God was leading you in battle, or that God was on your side? Was this a metaphor that was helpful to the troops?
There was zero religious content in the army.
Yeah, that was the sense I had from our discussion last week.
And as I believe is appropriate. Mm-hmm. Our reasons. There were plenty of Orthodox soldiers who would form, impromptu minions and, pray whenever they needed to pray. But There was nothing of an organized or official nature. It's a secular army.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's just very interesting how religious imagery evolves over time, and this imagery, there's a lot of imagery that we heard about earlier, and then that doesn't seem to resonate with us today. And but I wonder if there's a way to finesse that, to think about the strength, that is given to individuals with God on your side, so to speak. And of course, there's that question about, whose side is God on? It's like, is God a Red Sox fan? Which I think God is, but that's a different
yeah, although it took a long time in the wilderness before God heard the voices of Red Sox Nation. I think the idea that God is on our side is very dangerous and pernicious. We no longer have prophets. We no longer speak directly to God, and no one should presume to speak on his behalf or fight on his behalf.
On a lighter note, with God on our side, that I went to school in New Orleans at Tulane in the early 70s. And in those days, they had a benediction before the game. And a priest or a minister would come out and bless the players. And it was, as you take the field in God's name or Jesus' name, it was really creepy. And the thing that always got me was, so the winners had God on their side and the losers didn't. It was kind of odd.
Well, I think that, they say the temple was destroyed because people didn't put up the right mezuzahs, or the Holocaust happened. So, I guess the team that loses.
The team didn't pray hard enough to Jesus. Right. Just a little funny insert. Go ahead.
Zelda?
I was just going to say, we have a choice, and we have trust, and we have belief. And I think the trust and the belief for me is God is on our side, but it's up to us. It's not, I don't think God takes sides. It just doesn't work for me.
Steve?
It doesn't speak so much to me today, but I guess I think of it historically. Here you have a people who are going to come from a different place, from Egypt, and who are going to take over land. And it seems that this is about, sort of I bigger you, as we say in my family, recalling my 3-year-old son at the time. Who's got the power? Who's the force that's going to come in and take this land from other people? And so it seems that Adonai Tzvaot, this sort of the military illusion, is the way of almost like a press release and a warning and a notification that seems, perhaps appropriate historically. And so we're looking at it from kind of a history point of view of this nation who's coming out to conquer and led by a conquering God.
Raina?
Yes, this is Rena. I'm not comfortable with a God of war either. And but I am thinking about the enemy. An enemy can be human, can be a group of humans, it can be a disease, it can be our own, our own conduct, our own behaviors. I'm just thinking about the enemy and how is God or prayer helping us with that? Because it's anything that doesn't let us fulfill our goals.
Anybody else want to weigh in? I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's sort of a nice segue to one of the things that really intrigued me about this parsha, as I said before, and that is this phrase that God hardened the heart of the king of Heshbon, and sort of maybe the king of Heshbon really was planning to be to play fair and just let everybody go through with appropriate compensation, but God hardens this heart. And we heard the same story in Exodus, in the book of Shemot, where God hardens the heart of Pharaoh. And we talked about Shai Held's commentaries last week, and this was sort of a thought that came from him and from others as well. Is how does this concept of sort of God intervening and making somebody do something, in other words, hardening his heart, so he's not willing to listen to, make a decision on his own, so to speak, with the concept of free will. And a number of commentators have stepped in on this, and they said that God hardened, one says, Rabbeinu Baya says that God hardened his heart and made his heart stubborn. And this language is used when people that are being described are wicked in the extreme and beyond redemption. And again, he mentions that Pharaoh was another one of people whose free will was deprived because it was abused so grossly, Maimonides says. And they're basically saying that these people have so evil, that they have such a deliberate attempt to thwart God, that they are denied the opportunity to repent at a certain stage of their lives. Maimonides goes on to say, even when they're emotionally ready to repent, God causes some event which makes their minds resist such attempts. So Torah doesn't mention attempts by God to prevent Pharaoh from repentance until he's already failed to repent and his promise 4 times. In other words, Pharaoh says, okay, you can go away. Then he says no, and so on. So I think this whole issue of, is there a point in the lives of people where they're just beyond the pale, where they should be denied? Cliff?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And as much as I wonder about hardening of the heart and arterial sclerosis and all those other good things, in Ezekiel, there's a passage that said, I will remove your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh and put my spirit in you. So it anticipates a heart of stone, the hardening of the heart, and that would still be available. That God will be a heart surgeon. He will remove your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh and put his spirit in you. But at some point, it's got to be God. You've got to accept God, and I mean, it's hard. Some people, it's very hard to accept, that there is even a God. I don't believe in that. I'm an agnostic. I'm this, I'm that. And so that in a way is a hardening of the heart and is not going to allow God to come in and help. So anyway, I think that it's nice reading those together, to bump them together.
Interesting. Other thoughts on this?
Well, fortunately, throughout the Torah, God's heart doesn't harden towards us. He repeatedly becomes angry and frustrated with us. After the flood, yeah. After he's killed almost all of us off. After that, having given us the pledge that he wouldn't do it again, he repeatedly becomes completely frustrated with the nation of Israel and stands ready to strike it down. Sometimes strikes it down partially, but is always ready to listen to entreaties for him to not do it. Moses and Aaron are usually there to say, no, give him a break, don't do it. And he listens. So God provides a model for having a big heart, a heart that can be moved.
It's interesting that that this hardening of the heart doesn't happen to our people. It seems to, as you point out, it seems to always be described as someone else. Although I have an exception to that, which I'll mention in a minute. But David, why don't you chime in?
Yeah, I try to think of this in sort of a psychodynamic context. Can we think of hardening the heart as being impulsive, instinctive, non-reflective, kind of the animal part of our being, self-defensive, not altruistic, and that to soften the heart to our better selves, as it were, has to overcome that. Has to overcome that. And when we don't hear that small, still voice, when we don't have proper leadership and guidance, we act on this level of a hard heart. And it's only with some inspiration, and that's where our free will comes in, as it were, to override our will, to override that what would be a more natural, instinctive, baser response.
Although it's interesting, and Cliff, I'll call you in a second, and it's interesting that some of the commentators say that there is a point where you just lose that ability, that privilege, I suppose, to have your heart approached and softened, and I think that's the case that the commentators are making about Pharaoh, and in this case about the king of Heshbon, although we don't really hear much about why he is singled out in that way. Cliff?
Yeah, what I was, I appreciate that idea of the psychodynamic, because, and actually what it was drawing me to is the whole idea of Cain and Abel and Esau and Jacob, because that once you have the agrarian, the one that can settle down, it is in the settling down that you don't have to rely on instinct. You can rely on free will. But if you don't forget your instincts, I mean, there's that clash between them always. And Abel was softened, and Jacob was softened, and we are softened, and we have free will, but it would normally need to be in the context of civilization and how we build on a civilization, with the people who are the hunters and the Cains and the Esau's. How do you do that?
Well, if you think of the story of Moses, there's a pretty stern lesson in his not being allowed to enter the land of Israel because of his losing his temper and becoming, after 40 years of patience, losing his temper with the people and acting out. So we're in effect being taught the importance of self-control.
Mm-hmm. I think at the same time they're giving, and I think it was interesting. I was reading Yitz Greenberg's commentary on Devarim yesterday, and he starts off by talking how Moses was basically a failure by the end of Bamidbar. I mean, he led people in the desert only to die. His brother and sister died. There was rebellions. He seemed almost impotent near the end of the book, and that Devarim is his chance to sort of save his reputation. But at the same time, his heart was never really hardened. I mean, even though he's punished. I mean, I think if people were punished, there's sort of a difference between being punished and what God was doing in some of these scenarios is sort of make the actor, the bad actor, the one who's the devil, is the villain. So he's saying, I'm hardening the heart of the of Pharaoh, or I'm hardening the heart of this king in order to facilitate then a victory that you will have with me, God, as your standard. So the way that the children of Israel get out of Egypt is because Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and then God came in with the plagues. Although he had given some of the plagues earlier on without enough effect, so he had the ultimate plague. And here they conquer this land militarily in a way that they really just wanted to walk through. So, and that again showed this God as warrior thing as well. Did I see another hand going up? No.
No, I was just wondering about why our camera's blinking. I don't know if anybody else can see it, but it seems like it's blinking quite a bit. No?
I don't know.
All right,
I just saw a couple of blinks.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The camera's heart was hardened, and as a result,
right.
It's not working. I also found a call. Well, Velda, why don't you chime in as my chimes go? I'm going to just mute for a second.
I just wanted to say, we're all made in God's image. I mean, even Pharaoh is made in God's image. So that's why they need to harden the heart so that Pharaoh can come and, do his thing and whatever he does, So we're starting with, they're all in God's image. So they harden these hearts where we're fighting these people, and maybe that's what it is. I don't know.
I found also a quote from a psychologist. So Steve wrote it. Maybe you can see what you think of this. Erich Fromm, who was was a popular writer back in the mid of the last century. He wrote, every evil tends to harden a man's heart, and every good deed tends to soften it. In other words, to make it more alive. The more a man's heart hardens, the less freedom he has to change. And there comes a point where a man's heart has become so hardened and so deadened that he's lost the possibility of freedom and free will. And I wonder, Steve, I don't know if you're willing to comment on this. If you get a point where certain patients or clients get to a point where they just can't change, is that a fair analogy?
So starting back with Erich Fromm, he's terrific. This should be a real plug for people to read him. There's a certain context. He was writing after World War II, and so he's trying to make sense of the greatest evil, that we've seen, and the notion, hopefully moving forward, of after the war is won by the Allies and there's freedom brought to the world, what were we going to do with this freedom? And what are the challenges of freedom? And that's not so easy also. And also trying to make sense of authoritarian regimes, right? So first of all, these are problems that we haven't solved. What do we do with our freedom? How do we deal with authoritarian regimes? So there's just the context for him. You bring up, Bob, the really the hardest thing. How much can people change? And I was just saying to someone yesterday that I still think it's true that personality psychologists have long said that personality is mostly fixed by about 15 or 16. And Freud was even, fast drying cement. He said 5 or 6. Wow. And wow. It's pretty difficult in our society, which also wants to hold, for good reasons, and our religions, that people can always change. And we have very strong beliefs in that. And we do see that, but I think the message here is we have the capacity to change because we're B'Tselem Elohim, but we all know it's so hard. and we're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in which we'll face ourselves again and say, there I am again.
I suppose that the message for the high holidays is to pray that our hearts are not hardened so much that we can't come back. Rena and then Joel. Rena?
Yes, yes. Just listening to that we are all made in God's image, I was thinking about what I've heard a lot from the Orthodox, which is that the Noahide laws are made for everyone, but that the Jew has to go just a little bit extra. And that, for some reason, is very resonant to me in this discussion. That, yeah, that may be how the heart is hardened or softened if we don't keep to those Noahide laws. Then that's a hard heart. Anyway,
Interesting.
so
Thank you.
That's it.
Yeah, okay. Joel?
On another subject with this parsha, it appears that Moses and God is obsessed with land. Jews are obsessed with having land, not only obsessed with it, but will go to war and kill people to get the land. And this is really not mentioned at all when Moses was at Mount Sinai and got the 10 Commandments and all our commandments. There was no mention of the land, but the land and Jewish people become critically important to being Jewish is to have land.
You know, it's interesting that
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, yet the Torah doesn't talk how important. I mean, the importance is God and a moral, ethical life, not land.
Well,
be Jewish anywhere.
I believe that's true of all nations in the universe, that they are defined as a nation when they have land that they can live in as a unit. And so I don't think that's unique to us. I think that's universal, totally.
Right. What's unique to us is that we survived as a people even when we were deprived of our land. That we found a way to continue our existence in exile.
That's correct, David, but always with that longing to return to it. Always with the praying every single day and always facing Yerushalayim. So there was that connection.
We have survived 3,000 years because of the Torah, not because of land. God gave us this covenant.
Well, between religion and a nation. Yeah, keep in mind, you know, even in Bereshit, Abraham buys land, and the land with a capital L is actually it's a huge theme, definitely throughout the Devarim, and even in the Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema basically says that if you're not ethical, if you're not following God's laws, so to speak, you're going to be deprived of the land, or the land is going to be, is going to go to seed, and so on and so forth. That paragraph is extraordinary about responsibility. And yeah, Joel, I mean, it's ultimately about Torah, but at the same time, the land, and it's always with a capital L, particularly in this last book of the Torah, is something that is very special. And I think, as Varda says, we pray every day for the land. So, absolutely. Cliff?
Um, I wonder again, you know, the importance of land is for purposes of settlement. You know, if you, I mean, I love the fact that you know, Isaac was a, you know, built wells, and the only reason, so that allowed the migration, the internal migration, you know, away from the sea. And each time you have something like that, you're going to you're going to encounter other people. And there was the poisoning of the wells and all of those things. But the idea is, again, we're switching from being a nomadic people to being a settled people, and a settled people need a land, you know, and we're very fortunate. I like what somebody said. I mean, you know, we've lived with the Torah for 3,000 years, and that has kept us a spiritual nation. You know, it may be even greater than others. Um, but anyway, I appreciate the landed aspects of it, but I think it is part of the civilization, and and it is that conflict that you would have between those who are nomads and those who are settlers.
Well, it's we've got two great centers of Jewish life today. Israel and North America. That's what, you know, 80% of Jews in the world.
At least, yeah.
And one holds fast to worship and prayer and observance, and the other, many people in Israel do not feel that same draw by virtue of the fact that they're in the land and feel Jews by virtue of living there. There have always been these two aspects to being in the nation of Israel, or being Jews, however you want to refer to us. I think it's Hartman who talks about Genesis Jews versus covenant Jews or Sinai Jews. Right. There are Jews who are part of the nation because they are descended from our forefathers and are included automatically on that. And they don't have to do anything else in order to be Jews. And then there are Jews who are Jews by virtue of the covenant at Sinai, when the laws were passed down, and by observing those laws, we manifest our Judaism. And those two have been in, you know, there's a tension between the two that will always be with us. It's just part of who we are.
David, David, and then I'll come back to Cliff.
That's okay.
David?
Do I still have my hand up?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, you did.
I'm very much enjoying the conversation. I've been reading the book lately, Who Wrote the Bible, and, you know, the kind of documentary hypothesis and how the book was constructed, you know, Deuteronomy being, you know, standing alone along with the early prophets, and just kind of putting it in a historical context. What were people trying to accomplish as they canonized these parts of the Bible, as they brought it all together? And it's another layer of understanding, of emphasis. So the Deuteronomy, you know, kind of builds on Moses, and as opposed to some of the other books which emphasize the priestly or the Aaron branch. And I just find it, you know, I like the metaphorical discussion. That's where I usually go, but it's really something to cast it also in the historic context, what's going on, you know, from 700 to 500 BC, BCE. So I just put that out if anyone else has sort of encountered that that perspective.
Cliff, did you wanted to chime in, and then Steve?
Yeah, I love the words that Hartman apparently said with respect to the Genesis Jews versus Sinai Jews. But I wonder if I get lost in the label. And because at least from what I read, I think there's something in the Talmud and the wisdom of the fathers that says that Judaism is not inherited. You must study it. You must become, if you're a Genesis Jew, you are probably more likely to just say, to acquiesce and say, I'm Jewish, and never study and not get the depth of what Judaism really offers. And that was certainly me. I mean, you know, I didn't know what the heck this was, but it's only in the studying. And it was kind of like this last weekend. We're getting ready to move potentially, and went over to a friend's house, and they and they're conservative. I was, you know, I had a grandfather who was Orthodox, a grandmother who was Christian Science, and, you know, Reform and all sorts of things. So I'm, you know, he said, well, what are you? And he asked me, and he said, are you Reform? Are you, or, you know, I said, I'm Jewish. That's all I am. You know, I can't label, because I go all over the country, all over the world to listen. I don't understand Hebrew. Every now and then I'll pick up a little bit. But there is such a depth and joy in learning about this, these people, and watching, you know, what is the purpose of all these things that have been passed on for millennia, you know, to me. So anyway, so I'm neither Genesis nor Sinai. I just am.
Steve, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something, Bob, that you sort of framed the whole book at the start, and that David spoke about a little bit, in terms of thinking about this as a historical memoir, and sort of moving away from the details, you know, up 1,000 feet maybe. I was thinking it was really interesting that the idea of Moses getting to say, here's my version of the story. And you pointed out, Bob, how it changes. That's a very interesting way, if you step back, to think about the Torah. We often like to point out, and I think are proud, that the Torah and, you know, our Bible is, you know, as different people say, the canonization of diversity. Our Talmud, our Gemara, right, emphasizes the idea of difference in conversation that people have, as opposed to dogma. So right from the beginning, we have something that we know in our lives. When people get together, whether it's couples or a group of people on a committee, and they tell their version of the story, it's often very different what people's takeaway is. And almost from the beginning, our Torah says, and now here's Moses's version. As you point out, it doesn't say, and God said this. So it's an interesting message from the beginning, that it, I think, allows for the idea of different versions. And one more thought, I was thinking about like memoirs, political memoirs, or political speeches. When our leaders, our elected leaders, run for office, they love to tell the American story of, my parents or my grandparents were immigrants. They came here with nothing, and they often talk about their own story. Isn't it interesting that Moshe, because he's talking about the people and some of the difficulties, does not go back, does not go back to say, you know, I grew up in Egypt and here was my lot, or to say kind of early developmental stuff the way we're used to today, in which people reference how their beginnings, how their parents' beginnings shaped their view of leadership. It's a very different view from Moses than I think what we see today in leadership memoirs.
Well, it's not really a memoir, it's a sermon. It's with a very pointed message. But what fascinates me is that when you read in Lachim about Yoshiyahu discovering this book, it actually describes the moment when Dvarim was found behind a cupboard and suddenly became part of our story. It was the whole book was written and redacted for political purposes, and that's not to use the term pejoratively. I think it was designed to restate the laws in a way that was more relevant to the 7th century, and to unite the northern and southern kingdoms behind a common story. Nothing wrong with any of that. We can appreciate it for what it is, even if we recognize that it wasn't really written until, much later than it purports to be written.
Speaking of history, we have a sad day coming up tomorrow, and I just thought if you wanted to mention a couple of words about it, Bob, Tisha B'Av.
Let me save that for another 5 minutes, sort of as we close. But because I really wanted to pick up with something that Steve said a minute ago, and I alluded to this before, and that is that Moses, in telling the stories of the spies, in this parsha, sort of talks about all the positive things the spies said. They said it was the land of milk and honey, it was a beautiful place, and so on and so forth. And Moses neglects to report in this week's account of all the tumult that followed, all the negativity that the spies brought back. I mean, it was a horrible scene, another one of those very negative times in the desert.
Well, he does mention it.
Does he?
Yeah, like verses 26 through 28.
I don't have the book in front of me, because I mean, my sense of the current reading was that there wasn't a whole lot of talk about that, and he certainly didn't talk about.
Says, you refused to go up and flouted the command of the Lord your God. You sulked in your tents and said, because the Lord hates us, that he brought us out of the land, etc., etc. What kind of place are we going to? We saw their people stronger and taller than we, large cities with walls sky high, and even Anakites, giants. So it's there.
Oh, right. So
in passing.
In passing. Well, in passing, and it's interesting that Moses says, the Lord hates us in that phrase. I was fascinated by that, because here are these people who have seen miracle after miracle. They've survived 40 years in the desert, which is extraordinary given the fact that people don't tend to survive in the desert that way, with all the miracles of manna and everything else. And yet they say that God hates them.
Well, maybe it's progress that they've gone from saying that Moses hates them and blaming it all on Moses to saying God hates us.
And there was I read I don't know where I saw this, but they said sometimes when you have something in your mind about a friend and say this is what your friend thinks is really what you think about the friend, and the question is whether the people have started to hate God for some reason, and I mean, they just, I mean, story after story in the earlier books about rebellions, and of course they get punished for it, but I wonder if people have a comment about that, the fact that there's this sort of, I'm trying to think of the word, and I'm sure the psychologist among us can think of that word, but imputing your own feelings on your fellow man.
Projection.
Projection. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for.
Joel. From a non-psychologist.
Yes, Joel.
I think we've got to remember that Moses never went in the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote this prior. The people never went in the promised land under Moses. He died. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's looking at this from his perspective. And he was denied the fact of going into the land of milk and honey.
Well, Cliff,
he might have had a different perspective if he actually went into the land.
I'm sure that's true.
This sort of reminds me. I can appreciate Moses and everything else, but it is always the observer who is making that assessment or judgment with respect to that person being observed. You don't know what's going on in Moses's mind. Moses has been rewarded. He has led these people for 40 years. He has accomplished a great deal. Going into the promised land wasn't as important to him as being on the journey to the promised land. And in that, I guess it was sort of in that sense. I have a friend, he died last week, and we will have a funeral tomorrow. And I, his wife had made a comment that, he, had been reading all these Western novels. And I was sitting there thinking, why do you read? I mean, how many times can you cross the river? I mean, as far as you got to do that. And she said, while he was in intensive care, she took one of the books and she started reading it to him. And she said, there's always a brothel involved and they get something else out of there. So I'm sitting there going, this is the male romance novel. And, but until you do it, you think of it, you sit there and say, what is this? Why are you doing these Westerns? Now I understand why. You may find me to become a Louis L'Amour fan after that. I don't know, but it's learning that perspective. Thanks.
Well, I wanted to, we're just about at the end of time, and I did want to just make a comment about Tisha B'Av tomorrow. It's a time that we remember tragedies that have happened to the Jewish people, beginning with the destruction of the temple and beyond. And what troubles me, and I sort of mentioned this earlier, is the fact that every time there's a tragedy, there's a blame for that tragedy, whether it was hatred of a fellow man, or a tragedy in a nightclub because people didn't put up the right mezuzahs, or any number of other tragedies. And it troubles me that way. But I think it's really, I'd be interested if we have a minute or two just to think of what, if people have a contemporary meaning of Tisha B'Av in their own hearts in a way that they will be observing tomorrow.
I read an interesting comment from Rabbi Sachs about Tisha B'Av, that he said that actually it's believed that Mashiach will come on Tisha B'Av. And we're saying, well, it's the saddest day of the year. Why would, Mashiach come in the saddest day of the year? That doesn't make any sense. And the explanation is that because we've suffered so much, and because we've been able to endure, that the light will shine brighter on a darker day, and that will bring Mashiach. So just a thought to keep in mind.
That's a nice thought. I guess we could go on and on about talking about theology. I just really have a hard time saying that we the people of Israel, are punished by God for every bad thing. I think that some of the people, there are bad people out there who are bad people who are perhaps exercising their free will in a way that they've made those choices. And there isn't just a puppet master up there saying, you can't, you're going to do that to punish the people. At least that's my own theology. And again, I'm sorry to bring that up at 1 minute before the end, but it is, I think it's something to think about during Tisha B'Av, is to really think about what this observance will mean for us as individuals, and what we can do perhaps to affect the world. I mean, we talked. Someone asked. I think maybe Velda last week asked. How do we serve God? And we talked about the fact about being on, sort of God's foot soldiers, coming back to the earlier metaphor.
Yes.
But I think that, the question is what can we do? And what is this? How is it going to have meaning for us? I think we need to stop because services are going to start. And we do need to say Kaddish de Rabbanan, but I'm thrilled that everybody in my Zoom, computer screen has spoken today and contributed, and I love the discussion. There's a lot more we could talk about this, even this parsha. And next week we've got one of the highlights. So stay tuned to next week.
Yeshikah. Nice going.
Marty, do you want to lead Kaddish de Rabbanan?
Yeah, let's all stand for Kaddish de Rabbanan, which will be on the screen in a second. There we go. All right, everybody stand up, please. And let's... What?
Well, we can get started.
All right. Yid Kadal, Yid Kadash, Shmei Rabbah, V'alma Divrach Hirutei, V'amlich Malchutei, V'chayachon, V'chayachon, V'chayed Yisrael, V'agala V'zman Kariv, V'yimru, Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah, M'varach, V'olam, V'omaya, Yit Barak, Yishabach, Yit Golar, V'yimam, V'yinaseh, V'yitadar, V'yitaleh, V'yitaleh, Shmei Shabriku, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, Tushbachata v'nechamata, Da'amiran v'yalman v'yimru, Amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidehon, v'al kol Talmidehon, v'al kol ma'aliyasim v'yalaita, Divyata v'kol atar v'yatar. Yehi l'chol shlom rabba, China v'chisa rabbanim, v'chayim v'chim tzana v'chika, v'chana min kalam aluhan v'shmaya amen. Yehi shlom rabba min shmaya, v'chayim tovim v'el kol Yisrael, amen. Oseh shalom v'ramav, v'rachma v'zeh shalom. Aleinu kol Yisrael v'yimru, amen. All right, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. And just for those that mentioned Jeopardy, I have an answer that you might want to find a question to, and the answer is David Rosenson. So, what's the question?
Who's Darshan next week?
Who's the?
I want to know. I just asked a question about the question and the answer. David Rosenson.
Who's the best looking man in the room?
No. Who is a Jeopardy champion? David Rosenson. So there
Really?
I like that. So anyway, Shabbat
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom.
We'll see you next week.